Very good afternoon, and welcome, everyone, to this session on building city resilience and urban financing solutions. We have only 45 minutes, and this is a very bold and big topic, but not enough is being done. So we're going to try to focus in on solutions and also on things that we think can be done better and at scale, and a call to action to all of you to really join in the next steps in this journey. Joining me are some serious change makers in this space. And so we have Taina from Rio, Susan, Marc-Andre, David, and Ahmed. And we are going to, in this conversation, have quite an interactive dialogue. And to start that out, I'd be quite interested in a little bit of audience participation. So are you ready for that? Okay, silence is consent in this case. So I would like you to give a little applause if you're having a good cop so far. You having a good cop so far?
Yes.
All right, that's one step in the right direction. How about an applause if you've learned something new so far this cop? That's a very good sign. So the next one's a little bit more challenging. How many of you have had a radically honest conversation since you arrived at this call? That's actually very good news, because actually I wanted to begin by sharing that the reason I'm sitting here moderating this panel is actually because of a radically honest conversation I had with David Howden in Susan's beautiful city of Glasgow some 2 years ago. And that conversation, I might ad-lib a little bit, went a little bit something like this. David asked, Resilient Cities Network, 100 cities, 100 city leaders committed to building holistic resilience. They have capacity, they have strategies in place. Why are they not using more insurance tools? Why are they not using more potential tools for resilience finance to do the important work that they need to do? And my answer was very simple. I said the industry is coming with solutions and with products. And most of our cities don't have the capacity to actually ask the right questions and match their portfolios with those products. The parameters are not the same. And so an idea was hatched 2 years ago for something that has become a reality today. It was actually launched at COP27 in Sharm. It's the Global Risk and Resilience Fellowship. And together with Howden, we have been placing experts in insurance and finance into cities who have specific resilience finance questions. And over the last year, 5 cities took part in that, and Glasgow is one of them, so we'll come back to that later in the panel. But what we learned from that program, which spanned from flood risk in Miami to municipal solid waste questions in Surat in India, was that there are a lot more resilience financing tools that we can use. But we have to be able to define those metrics and that conversation in a similar way, and to invite public and private sector to have a longer term conversation, and one that builds lasting capacity in our cities to manage this change. So I share that story as a little bit of an introduction to our panel, because as we talk about resilience financing solutions, sometimes we have to take a step back and look at the landscape before we can take a step forward with solutions. And so in setting the stage today, I am going to be asking our cities, as well as our private sector partners, to talk to us a little bit about what does resilience look like? What does climate resilience look like? And then how do we finance that in a much better way? So I actually want to start with our cities, with the situation on the ground. And I have a question for both Taina and for you, Susan. And that is, what are the resilience goals in your city? And what are some of the barriers to financing those goals? Susan?
Do you want me to start? So I suppose the broad goal is for us to have cohesive and resilient communities that are able to withstand and to cope with stress, future stresses, whether in fact those are climate-related stresses or another pandemic, for example. And for us to, as a public sector, along with partners right across the city and beyond, to enable and facilitate the resilience of those communities through investment in the kind of infrastructure that they need. Specifics for Glasgow particularly, we have challenges around flood risk, and we need infrastructure to be able to manage and cope with and mitigate flood risk. And perhaps our other very big resilience challenge is around the energy efficiency of our buildings and the need in particular to retrofit tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in fact, of homes, of residences. We have very high levels of energy poverty in Glasgow, and that is related in no small part to older buildings which do not retain heat and do not retain energy. But that is getting worse as energy is becoming less secure, as energy is becoming more expensive for people. So those are two very big things. Along with other cities, we also have challenges around transport. We have challenges around the need to decarbonise heat and energy. But if we don't deal with those underlying issues, the adaptations that we need to put the basic fundamentals in place in the city, then our communities are going to struggle. And some of the interventions that we're going to have to make around, for example, shifting people onto renewable heat networks are quite disruptive. Mm-hmm. And they're quite significant interventions in people's lives. So if our communities are under enormous stress, if they're not cohesive and resilient communities, then we will fail actually to make that transition. So that resilience side has to go hand in hand with the decarbonisation part.
Thank you so much. But I think it's such important context that resilience is something that is where you live. It's in your home. And the decarbonization journey goes hand in hand with affordability. It goes hand in hand with what's happening at the community level. Tina, I wanted to turn the same set of questions to you. Rio, one of the world's largest cities, different kinds of challenges, but same question to you. What are the resilience objectives that you have in Rio?
Well, thank you. I'm going to go straight to the point. We have poverty, and we have a most gap fund in all the world because we have flooding, we have landslides, and we have heat waves. And where's the money to finance technologies that can construct and building solutions by the local way? And between the local way and international funding, there's a huge gap, and we're trying to creating buildings and dialogues and more profound our relations about this point with projects of adaptation, but we need more funds to finance our poverty gap, our social agenda, and our projects that can make more, can build more our solutions by the local way.
I think that's a very important point for us to keep in context. And you asked the right question, which I'm going to turn to our other panelists to answer. What is the gap between the international way, right, or international financing and markets and the way that you can access those kinds of both funding and financing instruments, and the local way, right? And there's a very big gap there, in particular, to finance social infrastructure. And so Tina asked a question quite directly that I want to pose to you, both David and Mark, which is, where is the money? Where is the money for that kind of social infrastructure? Where is the money for resilience finance? And how do we bridge that gap between the international way and the local way? David, I'll come to you first.
Okay, so I think, going back to the conversation we first met, Lauren, which was, in Susan City, and I think that the themes here have just, grown, which is that how do we actually harness the financial markets to provide solutions to the growing problems? They can, for this conference, be climate change related, but some of them are endemic anyway. And I think, to me, that is about actually, first and foremost, what we've done with the program this year is actually understanding what the requirements are, because I think that disconnect is very often there. And we found that actually, what is it that, in this case, the resilient cities, the cities want, and what is it the financial markets can provide, and how can we bridge that gap? And from my point of view, if you look at my market, which is the insurance market, it's really understanding how we can provide to those cities the resilience they want, which they talk about in terms of resilience, in our words. What does that mean? Yeah, and how do we support that, both really in mitigation, yeah, and adaptation, and really all of that. And then the second is, how do we bring the capital in to provide what we as an insurance market can and normally do, quite frankly, in many places, either in companies or countries around the world. So it's that connectivity of understanding what the problem is, yeah, adapting that to the needs of it, and then bringing the capital in. And I think some of that is a mix. And again, there's been some sessions, I've just come from one myself now, and there's one here this morning on philanthropy and how that, again, gets leveraged up to provide solutions. And I think there's linkage between all of those, I call it almost double de-risking. Badia on the stage was saying that philanthropy can de-risk some of the capital needed to bring capital in for projects, and that can help. I think you can double de-risk by bringing the philanthropy money in to de-risk, and then bringing in my case, insurance to de-risk as well, to bring more capital in. So actually the cities get what we want. We know that by 2050, 8 billion people, that's more than almost in the whole world today, are going to be living in cities. So we need to address this issue.
Thank you, David. I think you made a very strong point around the fact that a lot of this is about risk and common language, right? Being able to translate these concepts into a way that the market can understand and make that financing available and more available to places where it wouldn't normally go because it would not want to take that risk. So that's in terms of risk appetite. I think there's another piece of this here, which is about time, right? And so patient capital is very important in this. So Marc-André, can you share with us, what are some of the resilience financing solutions that you think that cities can be using more of, and what examples do you see that are actually succeeding?
Well, thank you very much, Lauren. And it's when I've heard the person from Brazil, from Rio, it brings me to, we need to deal with issues that we, capital and all of us together, have not been we don't have a long experience of dealing with this. We are used to do things in silos, but we're not used to, now we need to bring all of the solutions together. You have someone representing the insurance company today, sitting side by side with an institutional investors. We happen to be related. We are an investor in this fantastic company, but in Audens. But it just shows the kind of partnerships you'll need to resolve some of these issues. I'll talk about it. And my comment about the tough discussion, I'm trying to, what is the tough discussion? What I find is we refuse to admit in some of our discussion around COPs usually that, I had this discussion last night with the CEO of a global foundation, where I was talking about the first loss. I was trying to convince him to actually help us with, project preparation and make sure because there are risks that institutional investors cannot take. We have a return. We have 6 million Quebecers that are expecting us to provide a pension in when they retire. So we have a fiduciary obligation, although we are the number one pension funds in the world that is most aligned with sustainability, but there's a limit to what we can do. And sometimes, I was with Tony Blair this morning, like nobody wants to say it, but the opportunities need to be attractive to business, for business to invest in them. But the problem is it's more complicated and it's more complex, and we must do things that we've never done before. Like I was in New York City a few weeks ago, and I met the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, and they were trying to convince me or ask me about advice on how they should be structuring the financing of the wall, the seawall that they need to put there. Like, this is an issue we've never dealt before. I mean, there's no return. There's a very difficult to find revenues for a seawall. I mean, like, it's just so this is the kind of thing we will need to be that we need to come to the table to finance. I'll give you an example of what we did in Montreal that is astonishing. So you have a pension fund. We're a pension fund in Canada associated with the government of Quebec. We have agreed with the government of Quebec, the government of Canada, the Hydro-Quebec, which is the electricity producer. We did kind of a blended finance pool to actually finance the building of 67 kilometers of light rail train around Montreal. That's an $8 billion project. It's the longest line of light rail train in the world. And we did it, but we needed a return. So we have a preferential return that we've negotiated with the government of Quebec. We take risk on the volume of passengers. They've guaranteed us some rates. They've guaranteed us a so-called guarantee of a preferential return. And we made it happen in less than 6 years at a cost that is like, it's 100 and, the cost is just astonishing. It's something like $140 million per mile. When you compare it to the line on 2nd Avenue in New York, where they're now at 4.3 billion per mile. So there's okay, the other one is an underground metro. Ours is over. But the point is, there are many ways, many contributions that the private sector can come. So you can lower the cost of doing things. You can bring some capital, but it needs to be blended. There are some risks we cannot take, and we need returns, and we have to have that discussion. And this is the kind of things that we have to be better at having, because I think it's this blended finance model is more and more key to do what we all need to be doing. And but it's complicated. The number one issue that is a problem is the lack of trust between sometimes governments, private sector, and civil society, and bring it all together. The reason why the RAM was done, I'll finish on that, the light rail train was done in Montreal.
Yes.
There was a very, very unique alignment between, at the time, the government of Quebec, the city of Montreal, and the management of CDPQ. And there was a lot of trust.
Yes.
And it got done. This is an important part of the recipe.
I think that's such an important point. I want to come back to that and why perhaps there's not enough trust and not enough time that alignment may not be happening as often as it should. But before we do that, I want to come to you, Ahmed. You work in Masdar City, right? And you have probably an enviable position many city leaders would like to have, or many leaders of producers like to have, where you get to do a lot of creating, right? And looking at how to do things in an optimal way using technology. And so I wanted to ask you, what kinds of tools do you see, what kind of innovations do you see as building towards more resilience financing solutions?
Thank you, Lauren. I think just maybe let me start with giving a background to the audience, because we are here in Expo Dubai attending COP28, and I get often asked, what is Masdar City? Where is Masdar City? So Masdar City was created under Mubadala Investment Company in 2006 as part of a more holistic approach towards sustainability and diversification of economy. And that's exactly the point. And then, of course, we had great master plan, the most sustainable urban development maybe on earth. And then just 2 years after that, we had the financial crisis hitting the globe. So we had really to rethink exactly on how to be more resilient from a financing point of view. And it was very challenging to really reach out to your shareholder, the only shareholder back then, and still, Mubadala, to get access to funding to really build the city and create momentum. Of course, we had to be very innovative in that aspect. We had to give our shareholder the returns that they wanted to be able to build the dream city. Today, I can tell you we have over 1 million square meter of built-up GFA, gross floor area, with mixed-use community, offices, residential apartments, facilities, amenities, schools, and so on, with over 15,000 residents and business commuters living in Masdar City and working from there. We have more than 1,000 companies, local and international. And it was all done through this creative resilience financing scheme that we had to create, approaching the shareholder here, Mubadala, or the government of Abu Dhabi. And we were competing when it comes to really financing with other streams that Mubadala today has. And, they have multiple, opportunities to invest in. And we had to go and convince the board that Masdar City is the right approach to get or give the capital needed. So fast forward 2021, where we created the first green REIT in the region with, again, a huge, around today we stand at around 800 million US dollars, 3 billion dirhams. The size of the REIT that we have. And we also were successful in really creating the first green fund in the region out of ADGM, Abu Dhabi Financial Market, that was announced last week in the Abu Dhabi Finance Week. So for us, it's really to create the most sustainable city. Today we have the highest, or one of the highest LEED platinum buildings within our portfolio. And we had to make it really not only environmentally sustainable, but of course also financially and socially sustainable for our people. And today, I can tell you, we have the highest occupancy. We are almost 100% occupied when it comes to office buildings, and we are building more. So again, as we stand today, we have almost 5 projects that are net zero. And again, talking net zero in this very harsh environment is easier said than done. We have learned a lot through time how to really crack this formula and be able to really create the most beautiful and the most sustainable buildings on earth here out of Masdar City in Abu Dhabi.
Thank you for that, and for sharing that crossroads between sustainability and profitability, and also for starting us in a little bit on the issue of urban resilience and heat, which I want to come back to, because I think innovation around cooling and how you marry the increase in cooling needs and decarbonization is one that a lot of people are thinking about, and a lot of people are thinking about how they can invest in that in the right way. I want to come back to this alignment of interests and how we mobilize more capital for more important priority projects that protect communities. And Susan, when you welcomed a fellow into Glasgow, one of the challenges that you asked them to address was actually re-energizing, in a way, processes around building finance. And Glasgow did so much to align around financing during the COP. Really 2 questions. One is, what lessons can we learn from aligning finance around net zero for the resilience agenda? Because we have a huge gap, and I think we're all acknowledging that. We're not doing enough to invest in adaptation and resilience. So what lessons can we learn? What do we need to do to get that right? And then in Glasgow, practically, what are some of the things that you are all doing to bring that kind of financing home?
Yeah, so the 4 months that we had our secondee, Kenny, with us, I think it really, really opened our minds to the possibilities. And I think the thing to understand is that cities don't necessarily think historically in that way. We had never really thought about risk in the same sort of way. The public sector thinks about risk appetite very differently from the way that the private sector does. We think about risk appetite in terms of caring for someone with disabilities, or how many teachers we have in a classroom. It's very, very different. And so working with Kenny, he helped us to think about risk and de-risking projects. We had we called our Glasgow Green Print of 10 net zero projects, big investment infrastructure projects primarily, £30 billion worth, which is far bigger than any kind of investment that we've ever dealt with before as a city, like 30 times bigger at least. So we'd created these projects, but we knew that they weren't yet investable projects that we could really take to a private sector partner and say, this is something that you can put your money into and you'll get returns on. So Kenny helped us to work to understand the role of insurance, and that if you make a project insurable, you're a long way to making it investable. And I think that was something that was new to us, that we hadn't really thought about before. And that was an incredibly helpful matrix to look at those projects through. And also to think about how we bundled up different elements to try and get that confluence of where private sector needs and public sector needs can come together. So Mark's absolutely right. Flood defences, there isn't an obvious commercial revenue from those. There isn't an obvious commercial revenue from retrofitting older buildings, from retrofitting homes. But there are from new transport systems or from energy systems, heat systems, for example. So we've started to think more about how we can potentially bundle up the less commercial interventions, but which are often the ones that will really drive equity and will really drive resilience and those cohesive communities that I was talking about earlier, with something that is much more attractive to an institutional investor, but also recognise that it is something that we will need to have a long-term partnership on. This is not the traditional inward investment model where someone comes in to your city, builds a hotel, and then moves on to the next city. This is a long-term partnership, patient capital over a long number of years. Because at the end of this, my finance director keeps saying, we've got no problem borrowing the money, but we need to pay it back. And I need to be able to still deliver public services at the end of all of this. There's no point in me building all this fantastic new green infrastructure if I can't educate children or empty people's bins, because that's ultimately what they're looking for from me as their city leader. So I think we have really moved forward in our understanding of how we can find that sweet spot where public sector and private sector interests can come together, recognising that actually, ultimately, we all have the same shared outcomes, which is that we want to create communities in a planet that is safe and secure and is going to survive. There's no such thing as a public sector planet and a private sector planet. We all have to share the same places ultimately, and I think. I've said this elsewhere. For me, there's something about each of us getting over ourselves as well. You talked about trust, and I think that's really important. I think a lot of us in the public sector have to realise that we don't necessarily have a monopoly on wanting good things for the world and the planet and for society. We don't have a monopoly on wanting to bring about equity, on wanting to decarbonise. And I think the private sector needs to realise that the public sector actually can be pretty good at delivery as well. We can be very efficient and effective. And if we each realise that we've got those things in common, then I think there is a relationship of trust to be built there. But it's for us, that capacity building has been a big challenge, and the fellowship and having a professional embedded so closely with our team for that period was a real game changer in terms of us developing our expertise, but also having access to external expertise, which is always going to be better than anything that we have, but that's a partnership that we can return to and that we can continue to build on in future.
Thank you, Susa. And I think what you came around to, and so many good points in what you just said, around having a plan, right? Having a plan that you had ready to have the conversation about with a professional, and then aligning interests around that plan and having the time to build trust. And it's obviously built a lot of benefits and now some lasting capacity within Glasgow so that you can continue with this work. And I think it's quite interesting to also look at it from the private sector here, what kind of are the lessons that were learned on Howden side, David, and how this will go forward. And I also wanted to open up a second question, which I want to come back to the panel on, which is really around these moments and spaces to align trust and project financing. We're sitting here at COP. There are a number of other events. Are we using these events in the right way, right? Are there other opportunities that we can leverage to keep these conversations going in different ways? David, I'll come to you first.
So yeah, I mean, just picking up exactly on a couple of comments from Susan, I think this trust and collaboration point is key, and obviously, big part of what's going on in this part of COP is the SMR, and if you look at a number of the projects we did, I mean, working with the Glasgow was about understanding how we might bring investment in, so you wouldn't think necessarily that's a role of insurance, but then partnering with others. If you look what we did in Malakot, that was actually looking at the challenge they had around flood damage. But again, it was the connectivity, because we then brought actually over Arab in to help with actually the engineering projects on that. And I think connecting business, and whether it's a trust or an understanding, to understand actually how we develop stuff, I think that connectivity is very important. In Miami, again, we all know that although it's a highly developed country, there's significant problems around not getting insurance for the poorest around flood damage. And the mayor wants to know how we could do that. And again, bringing in partners, the Munich Re, we were able to actually provide parametric flood insurance for the most vulnerable. So I think that connectivity and the partnership, understanding what it is the cities need and then coming in and then being able to connect in that way, I think is critical. And I think that's one of the things that business leaders do quite well, and I think it's a good point you made, Susan, that actually getting better about actually doing it well with the public service and the other way round, and that goes back to Marc-André's trust point.
Yep, absolutely. Creating that space to say, we have actually a shared set of values around creating better infrastructure in these places that protect people and they create good common spaces that we want to share. So I want to open up that question around the spaces and the opportunities to build capacity, to look at those collaborations to the rest of the panel. What could we be doing more of? And maybe, Tena, looking at Brazil, you have an interesting 2 years ahead, right? Next year, as the host of the G20, you'll be having a number of very important meetings, and then the year after that, as host of COP. So do you think that we're using these kinds of opportunities for collaboration in the best ways we can? Or what are some of the things you'd like to see more of?
Well, we are living a great moment. We have, you don't mention, but we have President Lula.
The true climate champion. The true climate champion.
And of course, there's a great moment for Brazil. But we need, Marx just said a really important thing, that we need to blend our ways. We need blended our perspectives. While we're dealing with poverty and trying to make funds, finally a loss and damage fund in Brazil, in another way, we're trying to make, to building public and private partnerships. We are trying to make our own technology. We are trying to make buildings with a new moment by the century. And we are trying to protect our more poverty people. Because in climate change, the poor people feels and suffer with this, how can I say, this gap of opportunities and public and private solutions building at this moment. How can I say that? President Lula, Mayor Eduardo Paes, Secretary Tena de Paula, they are acting now for trying to building a future when leading with net zero, but leading with poverty zero.
Absolutely. That is so beautifully said, Tena, in terms of national level, local level alignment, and that intersection of social and environmental goals. It's not that you're doing one or the other, but you are aligning those goals together. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I think the panel has provided a number of very interesting points on trust building, on collaboration, on opportunities for investment. Are there questions from the audience for the panel? Okay, there in the middle of the
I have a question for the let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Shubha. I'm founder of N-Heroes Global Energy, and I am working on a net zero smart city project. And the idea is that this smart city project should pay all the bills of its residents. So there's a city that can pay itself and also fight the challenges of carbon bombs. So my idea is to each of you, like what responsible technologies and different business approaches you think city can adopt. So any one of you can answer to make themselves self-sustainable.
So how do we move solutions towards sustainability?
Yeah, self-sustaining cities. So what's your take?
Any examples?
I think I can give
Yeah.
an example of what we have done in Masdar City. Again,
Yes.
Creating cities that are commercially viable assets or asset classes and buildings. This is, of course, the founding foundation or the first step. Then what we have done again, clubbing all of this in a REIT, real estate trust fund, and then, of course, approaching finance institutions for funding, which we have also got, a mortgage finance from one of the banks here in UAE. And then ultimately, we'll be adding more into that REIT, and the objective is to reach into $1 billion within our portfolio. And ultimately, maybe in the next 3 to 4 years, we could go also IPO. So for us to create that model of self-financing scheme, this is one aspect. The second aspect is, of course, I think some of my colleagues have highlighted, is to create this private sector, partnership with the government or with the public sector. So we invite also private investors to invest with us in some of the asset classes that we believe are more attractive to them, like residential or schools or hospitals. So we can focus more on building ecosystems and commercial or more office buildings. So again, that model worked very good for us because we don't again compete with the private sector in that aspect. So mixing these both is of course help us to really achieve better returns for our shareholder, and then of course creating a model that could be financially self-sustainable or sufficient. But of course, what is more important is you need to create the ecosystem, you need to create the platform, you need to create that attraction for people to be coming and willing to live and willing to stay within Masdar City today.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are running very short on time for this panel. So it falls to me to start to bring this to a close, but not to bring it to a close for long. I think we've touched on a number of topics in terms of the solutions for building city resilience and financing solutions. And what's very clear from this is that we have really very integrated issues at play. We have a climate crisis and we also have an equity crisis. We have a poverty challenge that we have to address head on. And when we talk about building resilient cities, we need to have a very open conversation about both opportunities and vulnerabilities. I think what the panel has shared very concretely is that we have to really look at what the opportunities are for developing long-term partnerships that build capacity within the public and private sector to work together over a longer term and in a way that's specific and place-based. I think you heard from the examples on the panel, whether it be in Rio or in Glasgow and Masdar City in Quebec, that this requires a real knowledge and shared vision around what a city should look like, what kinds of resilience building characteristics it should have in order to deal with a future that is uncertain. And that we have to open our mind to new definitions of risk and how we can mitigate that risk together. And so I would invite everyone in the room to please commit at least one thing you heard from this panel to memory, write it down or jot it into your phone so that you can follow up on it. And this is very much a coalition of the willing. So I would encourage any of you who wants to learn more or be more involved in financing urban resilience solutions, please keep in touch with those on this panel. And with that, I just want to thank the panelists for their contributions and thank all of you for sharing your time with us this afternoon.